What's the system pilots least look forward to when learning to fly a new airliner? If you're anything like me, it's the flight management computer. It's absolutely essential to our day-to-day operations, but it takes such a long time to get our heads around. In today's video, I'll show you a set of techniques you can use to go from absolute newbie to master much sooner. G'day and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, a former Australian Navy and Air Force pilot and C-17 flight instructor. I've been away from flying for a couple of years now, and I'm in the process of getting back into the books and getting back into the air. I've joined a new Australian airline and I've learned the 737 MAX, and I'm looking forward to getting flying in the days and weeks ahead. On Adaptive Aviator, we're going to delve into pilot performance and learning topics that you might find valuable. We're also going to touch on mental health skills and hacks to help you get the most out of your flying career and, importantly, help you maximize your work-life balance. Pilot training has really advanced a lot in recent decades. We've gone from having the aircraft, the full flight simulator, and nothing else. And now we have a range of other devices, including competency-based training online, part-task trainers, and advanced briefing tools. One thing that really hasn't changed is our approach to learning. It's still very much a case of learning the theory, preparing for the event, flying the event or the training simulator, and then debriefing it. Whether or not those lessons get locked in is really up to the student. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how the meta-learning technique can be used to rapidly expedite your learning and go from beginner to master sooner. Meta-learning is a concept that's gained a lot of traction in recent years, thanks in part to the book Ultra Learning by Scott Young. And it's a concept that we can use to take a step back from our learning task, whatever that may be, consider what needs to be learned, how we can learn it, and in what order and sequence. Okay, so before we dive into meta-learning and how to apply that to the aircraft topics themselves, let's take a bit of a look at the flight management computer. If you're well versed on what these things are, how they perform their functions in the aircraft, feel free to use the description below or the timeline to jump ahead to the meta-learning topics. Okay, flight management computers, what are they? Well, you'd be forgiven for forgetting about the history of aviation, where just a few decades ago we had navigators and flight engineers located in the cockpit along with pilots. The aircraft management task, particularly large multi-engine aircraft, took a team to perform. And now the role of those two people, the flight engineer and the navigator, has been subsumed and shrunken down in electronic format into the flight management computer. So although this has made the task of flying the aircraft somewhat easier with a lot more automation, it also means when there is a fault with the aircraft and a significant problem with the flight plan or the fuel plan or the system itself in terms of the flight management computer logic, things can get pretty interesting pretty quickly. Okay, let's take a very simplified view of where the FMC sits into the scheme of aircraft systems. As you can see here, we have an overview of the aircraft flight management system. This is a generic view across any large transport type. Firstly, we have the AFCS. This is the automatic flight control system, which really fuses information from sensors and from the flight plan to maneuver the aircraft in a desired direction when the autopilot is engaged. So this is the thing that takes most of the work out of the pilot's role. The second is the flight management computer, or FMC. This is the system that uses the database and facilitates the programming of the route, both lateral and vertical, and continuously updates the information about the aircraft position. So it's calculating gross weight, fuel state, and a range of other factors based on sensors and internal calculations. And the way we, the pilots, interface with this is through the CDU, the control display unit, which is the keypad and screen we manipulate from the pilot seat. We also have the aircraft navigation system. So a package of sensors which updates our position in real time based on GPS latitude, longitude feed and inertial reference system data. It also gathers information from external nav aids such as ground-based VORs and DMEs to help provide a position solution. Lastly, we have the EFIS, or the Electronic Flight Information System. These are the large displays we're all familiar with in the cockpit, which allows us to be aware of the aircraft pitch, roll and yaw, as well as the navigation solution, where we're tracking what vertical path we're following. So the FMS provides the output to the flight directors and also the flight mode annunciators, which are key to pilot situational awareness and maintaining a track of what the aircraft is doing. So in summary, the FMC is really the central nervous system. It's really the brain of the avionics suite within the aircraft. With so many systems plugging into it, it dictates and controls things like our fuel performance, our takeoff and departure climb gradients, our navigation solution. It's really where the action happens in terms of aircraft avionics. Now, of course, the pilots interface with this system through the CDU, control display unit, which is the keypad and display located within the cockpit, and also through the display units and heads-up display in each control seat. Now, interacting with the FMC means getting it right, and getting it right can be the difference between a safe flight and a dangerous incident. The International Air Transport Association, in their publication FMS Data Entry Errors, Prevention Best Practices, highlights two particular issues where data entry was a major factor in incidents and accidents, one being the tail strike and runway excursion of an Airbus A340 at Melbourne, Australia in March 2009, and the second is the controlled flight into terrain of a Boeing 757 near Cali, Colombia. Now, there were a range of other factors contributing to both these incidents. However, it does go to stress the importance of knowing the FMC quite well and being able to manipulate it and make data entry and extraction with very low error rates. So how are we expected to learn the FMC? What's the traditional learning path for a pilot? It starts out, as many of you will know, through online learning or competency-based training. So in my case, it was a module of about 25 units, all completed online, about 2 weeks worth of clicking the equivalent of PowerPoints in slow time. It's an effective system. Operators and airlines love it. Not the most exciting or involving way to learn, I think. Now, the key tool, I think, for understanding the FMC and practicing how to use it is the Part Task Trader or emulator. This is the low-fidelity version of the full flight simulator, which has a fully working CDU, the correct software, and enables us to practice data learning, manipulation, data retrieval, and essentially rehearsing the whole flight profile, all from a briefing room. And lastly, but not least, the full flight simulator. These can be quite expensive to operate. There's not a lot of them, and their time is quite scarce. We've got to learn a lot of different sequences, a lot of techniques in the full flight simulator, which is why other learning tools really come to the fore in maximizing our learning. Okay, so that's the systems and facilities we use to learn. Beyond that, it really comes down to the quality of the instructors, the enthusiasm of the student to get us through to that level we need. While work is underway on more advanced training solutions, more advanced simulation technology and metaverse type immersive devices, what hasn't really been looked at in great detail is the learning techniques that the students apply themselves, their ability to reflect, absorb lessons and learn. Because of this, is really a big opportunity to apply meta-learning techniques, I think, to aviation learning challenges. And next, I'm going to touch on 5 tips where you can apply meta-learning techniques to learning the FMC or other systems. Tip 1 is to have a competency timeline in mind. This is about having an idea about what standard we need to reach by the end of a particular training course, what progress we need to reach that standard, and really allowing that to guide our effort and our improvement throughout. Now, if we look at Air Force pilots, for example, they use a category system for mapping out the levels of skill and competency required by pilots over time. So by doing this, they can understand that high levels of competency requires more time and effort, but also set realistic expectations of themselves as they progress through the system. Now, we can apply similar thinking to our approach to our type rating and our line training, knowing that only towards the end of the piece will we reach the high levels of competence and performance. Now, what's a useful way we can use this approach to think about learning the FMC and progressing through our type rating? Well, I think we can develop a couple of standards or a couple of benchmarks to aim for, bearing in mind these approximate standards. They're useful but not exact, and they're not drawn from any particular curriculum or training standards. But if we break them down across first officer and captain and break them down for levels that we expect to achieve by the end of type rating and the end of our line check, and the purpose here really is to serve as a useful guidepost so we have something to aim for that's challenging and realistic but not excessive for our needs. Okay, tip 2 is building familiarity with both the flight management computer and also the assorted publication suites that support it. Now, this really applies to 3 different levels. The first being familiarity with the FMC, the CDU, keyboard, screen, and the terminology, data input rules, the pages, and the cockpit alerts for that particular system. Knowing these will really be helpful in the initial few simulators where you can understand the basics and pay attention to the actual sequences that are being trained. The second piece is really about awareness of what's in the publication, and that comes from scanning through the Flight Crew Operations Manual in Boeing speak, and also the Quick Reference Handbook to understand where the sections are on that particular system, which systems relate to your previous experience and you're familiar with, and what areas are going to take extra learning or might be challenges in the future. And the third area of familiarity is on the FMC itself, and this is where time on the Part Task Trainer or the simulator briefing tool is absolutely imperative for getting the hang of the system, getting a hang of the pages, and getting a feel for what we're going to be doing in the simulator. So by focusing on these 3 areas of familiarity, we know enough to get around the course to be fairly comfortable with the direction it's heading in and not to be blindsided by any procedures, checklists, or other learning events that come up. So tip 3 is to focus on our weaknesses. Now, if we're pretty rubbish at one part of the aircraft operation or operating a system like the FMC, there's no point focusing on our strengths. We need to be fairly well performing across the board. Back when I was learning the FMC equivalent on the Seahawk helicopter, I would spend time on topics I was already strong with, or I had a preference for, or I enjoyed researching and reading about. It was only when I stepped into the C-17 that I realized I needed to put effort into building up my accuracy and being very, very accurate at what I was doing, and then focus on speed and fluency in that order. Okay, tip 4 is test, test, test. This theory is all about active recall. The idea here is that we don't learn by putting things into our brain, but by taking them out of our brain and assessing our ability to remember. Now, the beauty of the aviation training system, particularly for pilots, is that this is an inbuilt system. We're being assessed, we get feedback frequently, we get a lot of data and a lot of chance to reflect. So if we're struggling on a particular task, like doing a route modification on the legs page of the FMC, or loading a standard arrival or an instrument approach from the database, we can rehearse that procedure, go through the steps in our mind, and really cement that knowledge. The second way we can test ourselves is to maximize the feedback that comes from the course itself. Every simulator event we do offers feedback on a number of levels, and really making the maximum use of this, locking this away and reflecting on it is really paramount to maximizing our learning. Now, we can do this over 3 levels really. The first is self-assessment, and what I like to do is to carry a notebook with me in the simulator. So anything that comes up that's either a repeated error, more than twice that I've got it wrong, or it's something that I don't fully understand or need to look into, I can jot down a couple of quick words. It takes about 2 seconds, and I've got that there, ready reference I can come back to after the event, and it saves me from forgetting what I've come across. The second piece, of course, is instructor feedback. Just noting what feedback they're giving you, whether these points are forming a general theme, and they might just point to something that's becoming a weakness or could become a weakness if more effort isn't devoted to that area. The third area, which is often overlooked and easily overlooked, is feedback from our course buddy. Typically, we're lined up with one other person to go through a type rating conversion course, and we're with them from the start to the finish. It's important to have a think about and to reflect on the areas they're doing well in, the areas they're not doing well in, and what we can learn from that. The other piece there is how they're preparing. If the person has more experience or a different type of experience, then it's likely this is something we can learn from and we can have a think about. Okay, tip 5 is immersion, getting in extra repetitions. This is another principle advocated by Scott Young from Ultra Learning. He gives the example of people who've been able to become fluent in a new language in just 3 months. Now, they do this by going somewhere and being immersed in that culture, in that language. So they're getting feedback, they're having to step up to the plate, they're having to really sink or swim at a rapid rate. Now, the best example I have from my flying career when I had rapid feedback like this was back flying the PC-9 on the advanced pilots training course in the Australian Air Force. During our advanced flying phase, we were doing aerobatics, we were flying circuits, touch and goes. Great time, but very busy, and we were doing this twice a day, 5 days a week. So we'd fly dozens and dozens of circuits, dozens of aerobatic maneuvers every week. And through that procedure, we got very, very good. And we were really going through a workup procedure to make sure we had the right level of competence, the right level of performance to pass the advanced handling test, which was one of the last tests on course. Now, I contrasted that to when I arrived at C-17s, where as a new first officer or a new co-pilot, you'd go onto the line and you'd be flying long-haul missions around the world with a number of other pilots. So you might be one of 3 pilots. And in that situation, I might have the opportunity to do a takeoff or a landing once every 2 or 3 days. So much less feedback, much less repetition. And as a consequence, it just took a lot longer to get up to a high level of proficiency and a high standard of performance. So how can we access more repetitions in the simulator training environment? Okay, a couple of suggestions here, some of which we need to clear with your instructional staff at your training facility. But the first and foremost, I think, is getting onto the part-task trainer or getting onto the briefing room training device and spending more time on it. There's no substitute for direct experience with the FMC, and this is sure to pay dividends quickly. The second is just to experiment with training events on the simulator itself. So are there other ways to accomplish certain things? Are there different ways that you've been thinking about accomplishing things that you'd like to test out? Make sure you let your instructors know that you're planning to do so, but feel free to test the limits of how the flight management computer works on your particular aircraft. Okay, the next method is to ask targeted questions of your instructor. Now, there's only limited time before and after simulators, and it's important to focus on the events for that day. But if you've got questions hanging from previous events that haven't been resolved, it's worth bringing them up and asking if there's time for a quick demonstration or time to practice on the simulator itself. The last point is to rehearse the sequences mentally by reference to the Flight Crew Operations Manual or your flight manual. You'll find that a lot of the manipulations and a lot of the procedures for FMC use are actually laid out quite clearly in your flight manual. So going into them, reading them through, and then mentally practicing them is also a useful technique. Okay, that's my 5 tips for using meta-learning to increase your performance when learning a new aircraft type and tackling a system like a flight management computer. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, you might like to check out my earlier video, 5 things I would do differently on the 737 MAX type rating. If you found value from this video, go ahead and forward it to someone who you think will find it useful also. Don't forget to subscribe And if you've been able to employ any of the techniques I've talked about today, feel free to comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, thanks again, and I'll see you in my next video.